So, hey, everybody, this is Dr. Jamie, and I am so glad today to be joined for this guest interview by the Reverend Dr. Mark Sandlin. Mark is a Presbyterian minister. He's the author of a beautiful volume, Progressive Prayers for Progressive People, which we highly recommend. We've read through it, prayed through it. And Mark has been on my social media before talking about the clobber passages. That's how I first found Mark's work. Since Mark is a very affirming pastor for our LGBTQ plus community. Yet today, the issue at hand is abortion rights, specifically that you can be Christian, you can be a first person of faith and support abortion rights. Is that
the 100%, 100% true. As a matter of fact, I always tell people anytime they're trying to use the Bible to speak to a healthcare issue, you're using it wrong. Like, I don't recommend using a book that was written 2,000 years plus ago to make choices about modern health problems. Bad place to start. You just shouldn't do it. But if you're going to do it, it turns out that the Bible doesn't say what the anti-abortion folks seem to think that it says.
Go on. What do they
they tend to think that there are some really clear delineations about that abortion's bad, you shouldn't do it, that it's being judged by God, that kind of thing. But the reality is, if you look at the text, first of all, in terms of directly talking about anything related to abortion, the New Testament says nothing, not one word. It's just nothing there. And that's okay, because the folks we're talking about frequently prefer to look at the Old Testament anyway. So if we want to go Old Testament, there are a few places that you could point to that seem to have relevance in this argument. Like, one would be in Genesis, where we learn that life begins at breath, at first breath. Now, again, I don't think you should be using this to make health decisions or even say, but if that's what you insist on doing, be honest about it.
Right.
And that's what it says in Genesis. In Exodus, we have an example where a fetus is not given more rights or even equal rights to a woman, where it's very clear biblically that there is that the woman should have the primary rights. Numbers even says that in the case of adultery, that a fetus should be aborted as proof of adultery. So I think that the Bible probably, like I said, just doesn't say what they'd like for it to say or even what they want it to say.
So I'm going to go to what I was spoon-fed in both the evangelical movement and the Catholic Church, which is like right in the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill. And I think it's this kind of bludgeoning tactic that abortion is murder. You're killing babies. You're celebrating the killing of babies. And it says clearly in scripture, thou shalt not kill. So I'm curious how you respond to that argument.
Right. Well, I mean, first of all, I am no scientist. I am no biologist. I'm no doctor. So trying to define at the point that life actually begins is a whole different question that I'm not equipped to say. But it's certainly not in the first several weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 9 weeks. It's certainly not, which is where they're trying to make the lines for all of this. And then I simply always go back to the fact that was talking about a individual, a one being by themselves, and not about a fetus, which is a whole different issue, even biologically is a whole different issue. And that the few places, as we've already discussed, that the Bible does talk about fetus, it makes it really clear that the mother's life is the primary life we are to be concerned with.
So help me understand the scriptural case for that the mother's life is the primary life we're to be concerned with.
Well, for me, I would go to the New Testament, which doesn't say anything about abortion, but we do have Jesus trying to tell us what the most important law is. What's the most important thing as a follower of the teachings and examples of Jesus? What should it be? And that's simply to love your neighbor. And when it comes to the issue of abortion, there have been lots of studies and also just realities that I think the question of is it loving becomes very important. There was a study out of the University of California, San Francisco, that showed very clearly that abortion helps most people in measurable ways, like you can measure it. And so if you prevent a woman from being able to have access to that, my question is simply, is that a loving thing to do? For men, if they choose, their sex life doesn't risk their future.
Mm-hmm.
That's not true for women, particularly when you don't allow abortion. So my question again is always, is it loving? Is that a loving way of approaching this? That's the key thing that Jesus said we're supposed to be. Mm-hmm. Banning abortions gives a mother less rights than a fetus. Safe abortions are actually a medical necessity that prevent death in some cases. And again, preventing a woman from having access to that is definitely not a loving thing to do. As a matter of fact, women who are denied abortions, and a really ridiculously high percentage end up jobless, frequently below the poverty line, victims of domestic violence. Forcing a person into a position where they don't have a choice about that is not a loving way to approach another person. I could go on and on, but I won't.
Yes. And that's ultimately where I had my shift in thinking from coming out of growing up doubly religious. And even in those containers, it was very much, we got Family Research Council type studies about how women regret abortions, and you'd have your cases come forward. And I even say now as a clinician, yes, there are people who suffer trauma after having an abortion and may have regret. If you look at the vast majority of the non-biased literature that's out there, it ends up being a good decision for most.
Yeah, absolutely.
And is, like you said, the loving thing.
Yeah. And one of the crazy things about this having become a religious issue is that it didn't used to be a religious issue at all.
Especially for Protestants, is my understanding.
Particularly for Protestants, but even for Southern Baptists. The Southern Baptist Convention in 1971, 71, 72, and 74 passed resolutions, 71, 72, 74, passed resolutions to endorse access to abortions, going as far as to say that that the government, that the government should play a very limited role in any decision about that. And then there was a whole big court case that made them change their story. It's oddly rooted in racism.
Yes,
the reason they decided to make abortion an important issue.
That is very true. And I highly recommend for folks the documentary called Reversing Roe. It is on Netflix. It was made in 2018 before Roe was overturned, but it explains this whole history about, especially for evangelicals, when it wasn't cool to be racist anymore. This became,
they had to find something else.
I should say it wasn't cool to be publicly racist. We know that racism is still insidious in a lot of church structures, that this became the battle cry.
Yeah, it's actually rooted to Alexander v. Holmes County Board of Education, where they were told they had to integrate schools. And within 2 years, there were no white folks in the public schools. And so where'd they all go? Well, they all went to these private, tax-exempt evangelical schools. And they were sued for, obviously, racism, racial discrimination for that. Of course, the folks that sued won. And so they were like, okay, well, we've got to do something so that we can continue to be racist, but we just can't be outwardly racist about it. What do we need to do? And there was actually a conservative political analyst, Paul Marich, who came in and after about 5 years of study, figured out that abortion's the one. If we can make that important, we can win all the things we want, particularly quietly racism and racist issues and matters, if we can just make abortion important. And it never was. And for good reason, because biblically, it's just not there. And what is there actually goes the other way.
Makes sense for me. And I can't really explain to people, unless your heart is there, what really caused that shift for me as somebody who grew up with a lot of this rhetoric thrown at me. And I want to be a good Christian, so I have to support life. I don't want to be responsible again for that murdering babies thing. And I know always comes out when people don't want to deal with issues of moral complexity. And this idea that life is more nuanced than this, because even in diving into the medical research on my end as a clinician, because I know so much of this debate, when does life start? Is it at first?
Right.
Is it at conception? Well, medically, a fetus also meets a definition of a parasite.
Right.
That's hard for a lot of people to hear. They are completely dependent on their host to survive.
And there are pretty definable points at which point that might stop being the case.
Right.
But it's nothing close to where the laws are being made. It's ridiculous how it's been approached, and how that simple, overly simplistic argument has been used to manipulate so many Christians.
Right. And I've shared this in some of my blogging and my memoir on my Catholic Protestant upbringings coming out next year. And I talk about how one of my turning point moments, like I actually owe it to my clients, being a clinician, being somebody who's in the service of others in their woundedness, is a lot of what got me to open my eyes. Because there was one client years ago who got pregnant when she had an open child protective services case for some other issue she was dealing with. And she was struggling because she goes, I'm going to get in trouble with child protective services because I got pregnant. And so it was a real kind of double standard that women are in, like they're damned if they do, damned if they don't. They're morally flawed if they get pregnant. And ultimately, she ended up carrying the child to term. But I remember as her therapist being like, I cannot put any agenda on this. I just need to listen. And then I had another client who really impacted me when she talked about coming from this very wealthy, influential Republican family who secretly secured her abortions when she got pregnant because they didn't want it to that bad for the family either.
And that comes, it kind of brings it back full circle to the fact that the abortion issue started actually as a racism issue. And the fact is, when you ban abortions, this I can promise you, rich families are still going to get abortions.
Yes.
It's those who have lower income who aren't. And when you look at the way that the economic system is structured in the United States, there are many more folks of color at the bottom who will not be able to get abortions. So they've come full circle and made this a really solid issue of race yet again.
Yes. So hard question. We're people of Christian faith, and we can see that. What keeps people from seeing that who may identify as Christian?
Unfortunately, I think it's the teachings, the long teachings of the church of just hear what I say and say it back to me. Don't overthink it. Let me think for you. That open mind is the devil's playground kind of thinking. And the church has spent a lot of time making sure that the constituents don't, that they just trust the higher ups and just, you say it and I will say it back to you and trust that you are correct. I think that we have ourselves to blame.
And that's all about power and control, which we could probably
do
another
a whole different thing on him.
So Pastor Mark, tell us about your work as a clinic escort, because I've been noticing on social media about it. I'd love to hear what you do as a pastoral figure with helping people at clinics.
Sure. I volunteer with the clinic escorts here locally in Greensboro, North Carolina. We have an incredible crew of folks. I'm one of 4 ministers who are part of it, and there's lots more folks than just, us 4 are a little tiny number of them. Well, we go out every week. There's always protesters out there. They're always using really horribly manipulative psychological warfare kind of things that they're spinning at folks, trying to interrupt the free flow of traffic in and out. Think about if you were going just for your checkup. Every time you went to the doctor's office, there was a whole bunch of people there trying to stop you and trying to tell you what you're doing is wrong. And, like you haven't put a lot of time and thought and care into making the decision already. So what we do is we show up and we just try to make sure that the clients get in with as little harassment as possible, try to make their day as easy as we can make a very difficult day. And if, every once in a while someone wants to speak with you and we're all very equipped, they train us on how to interact and how to make sure that people are all right. A matter of fact, I've seen some of our volunteers who are definitely not ministers, haven't been trained in ministry, don't even go to church, have given the best loving care to the clients in difficult situations. And I sit there and I think, I bet most ministers couldn't have done the job nearly as good as those folks are doing. It is wonderful to see how giant their hearts are and how earnest they are about making sure they give the best help they can.
Because that shows me it really is about ministry of presence and compassion.
It absolutely is.
So this is more a personal question I have for you, because you're out there doing this hard work with the LGBT community advocacy, this kind of advocacy. How do you keep shielded? Like when you hear these things at you, what advice do you have?
I think trying to understand the story of the person who's throwing all those things at you. Mm-hmm. Rather than taking what's being said personally, start recognizing that the person who's doing it has a need to project those things to you and to begin to try to understand what that might be, because it helps you not take it so personally. Mm-hmm. And it makes you also realize what they might say. I mean, I've had death threats. I've been called the mouth of Satan. But once you start realizing they have a story and there's a reason where they are right now, there's a reason why they feel like the best option, the thing that they need to do is to be aggressive or bullying towards you. I think that that's the beginning of it. And then just going back to what we were just talking about, that Jesus said, the most important thing is to love your neighbor. And that, yeah, it's even your neighbor who's being really, really mean to you. You've got to try to begin to understand them enough that you can be loving towards them, even if their actions aren't loving. Understand that there's probably more going on there.
Agreed. And I still pray for that grace to, some days I got it, some days
it's not always easy.
So
yeah.
So Pastor Mark, thanks for joining us. If you're listening to this and you're an Ohio voter, the deadline to register is on October 10th for registration. I'll make sure I put a link in the notes for this for voter registration. The election is November 7th, but of course there's early voting in all the counties. So it's a yes vote on issue 1 for November if you want to secure abortion rights in the Ohio Constitution. And even if you're not in Ohio, reshare this interview, because there's likely you have friends and contacts in Ohio who may watch this. And again, Pastor Mark, thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you. I appreciate it.